There was a man who came to a church service one Sunday in rumpled clothes. He needed a shave. He probably needed a bath. He looked conspicuously like what we call a street person. One thing for sure, he sure stood out in that congregation. He didn't look like anybody else. So much so that the congregants tried to ignore him. They tried to pretend that he wasn't there. You might say they even tried to shun him. At the end of the service, the minister gently took him aside and chided him about his appearance. And he said to him, "Perhaps you should ask God, what's the right attire to come to church?" And to the surprise of the minister, the man responded, "Well, I did. I asked God, but he said he didn't know because he had never been here before." The very familiar parable of the Good Samaritan, every time we hear it, we should pause and reflect. Because you see, there are times during our lives when we have the opportunity to do good for or to someone, and to ask ourselves, did we do right by that person? Did we respond as we should have with love and mercy? And if we didn't, then to pray to God to be more charitable in the future. This parable is so familiar, I'll bet you could have spoke it back to me in your own words, or maybe even quoted exactly the words that you heard. It's very familiar to you. You know it maybe even better than I do. Now, Maestro, do you remember last school year we had this gospel, and I had the kids enact the different parts? And they knew it, and they were very eager to do the parts, but one kid surprised me as an aside. He was eager to play the donkey, remember? Now, I don't know what Freud would say about that, but those kids knew the parable, and I know you know it too. So guess what? I'm not going to speak primarily to it. I'm going to speak primarily to our first reading and how it kind of lays the groundwork for Jesus' parable. The book of Deuteronomy. The word itself comes from two Greek words which mean second law. The book was ascribed to Moses. It's the fifth book of the Bible, of the Old Testament, what the Jews called Torah, the law, the instruction. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is presented as Moses' farewell to the troops. He's about to die on Mount Nebo, and Joshua and the Israelites are about to enter the promised land to conquer it. And so he gives his farewell address, his last will and testament, his final discourse. Actually, there are 5 discourses in it, just like the 5 books themselves. And actually, some form of the book of Deuteronomy dates from the 7th century BC. You see, there was a reformer king in Judah whose name was Josiah. The Israelites had fallen away from Yahweh worship. They either had stopped worshiping Yahweh to worship Baal, the Canaanite god of fertility, the storm god, the thunder god, Baal, Sumerian El, God, Ba, the life force, the god of life, or they syncretized the whole thing together. Worship Yahweh on one hand and worship Baal on the other. And they had done some things in the temple. And Josiah was trying to reform the religion to get them back to the basics. And they were cleaning out the temple, legend says, and his high priest Hilkiah found this scroll someplace. And he pulled it out. And it was an early form of the book of Deuteronomy. The final form of the book of Deuteronomy that we have today dates from after the return from the exile, as most of the books of the Old Testament were put in the form in which they exist now at the end of the Babylonian exile. In this case, by what we call P, the priestly tradition, who redacted the entire Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So they had this law, second law, Deuteronomy. And the central theme goes like this: if you do what's in this book, it's the roadmap to human achievement and success. If you don't do it, it's the roadmap to failure. If you do it, God will bless you. If you don't do it, you'll be punished and cursed. And that's why we're here in today's first reading. If only you would heed the voice of the Lord your God and keep his commandments and statutes. In other words, do this, God will bless you. It became the basis for the theology of the great prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel after the return from Babylon. You see, God was saying exactly how his people were to act. The problem was they didn't. And the exile itself was explained by the fact that they had not kept those commandments and statutes of the Lord their God, and therefore they were sent into exile, into Babylon. The only hope of Israel then was to be reconciled back to God, to keep those statutes and commandments that he had set before them, telling them how exactly to live their lives. We hear, it is something very near to you, already in your mouths and in your hearts. You have only to carry it out. Israel's problem was not that they didn't know what they were supposed to do. Israel's problem was they didn't do it. They knew it, but they didn't live it. And that's the rub, isn't it? And it's the same with you and with me. We know what we're supposed to do. We have the Bible. We have the teachings of the church. We have a person called Jesus Christ. You know, if this were a Protestant church and the congregants were asked, what were they a people of? They would say they were people of a book. They ask a Catholic, he or she is going to say, we're the people of a person, Jesus Christ. And by his teaching, his preaching, and how he lived, and even how he died and rose, he shows us how to live. All we need to do is carry it out in our lives. But again, that's the rub for you and me, isn't it? Jesus gives us a concrete example of how exactly to do that. It's called the parable of the Good Samaritan, by showing love. Because love and mercy, well, that's the foundation of all laws, of the entire Torah, the entire preaching of Jesus. It's the basis for everything. Love of God and love of neighbor. And oh, by the way, everyone is our neighbor. The Good Samaritan story. So today, that ancient book of Deuteronomy still challenges you and me to carry out what the Lord our God tells us to do in our lives. To love, to show mercy, to love God with all our mind and all our heart and all our strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Because you see, our God loves us with an everlasting love.